That was an awesome presentation. I'm Rick Siddaway, if you don't know me. PowerShell MVP, I'm a scripting guy. I'm going to cover sim sessions, which Ed just basically touched on. So, a few references, PowerShell in depth, and PowerShell in WMI, got a whole bunch of stuff on this as well. Code and slides will be available. And I'm going to run a little competition. I've got 3 sessions. I'm going to have a mangled quote in each one, or a quote of some kind. Somebody can tell me where they all come from and answer the questions associated. There's a copy of PowerShell and WMI for them. This one's a mangled quote. If you can recognize this one, it'll get you well on the way. And that's it for the slides. I'm going to Emma, this is where things get interesting. If you've seen any of my sessions before, this is where things start to go wrong. Right. How many of you use WMI? How many of you love WMI? Oh yeah. Yeah? How many of you hate WMI? Same here. Yeah, I like both. WMI has been around for a long time, and with PowerShell 3, we get something called CIM. CIM is WMI is CIM. So WMI is Microsoft's implementation of the CIM standard. CIM is the next version of accessing WMI and CIM. And you get a bunch of commandlets. What do you do if the demo works? There we go. If you look at those, some of them will look familiar. So get CIM instance, equates to get WMI object, remove CIM instance, no prizes for guessing what that links to. Some of them, like the get CIM class, get associated instance, a little bit new. But we'll whiz through those and then we'll have a look at the CIM sessions. Will, if you can actually see what I'm showing. So get CIM class is your introduction to WMI classes. It picks them apart for you. How many of you gone hunting for documentation on a WMI class and struggled? Yeah, MSDN, it's there sometimes. It's there, not there very often. This allows you to pick the class apart. So you can see the methods and the parameters that are associated with them. We'll drill down into that in a second. And the nice thing about this is you get to find out what type of data is expected by the parameter. You can look at the properties, and it'll whiz through all of them, telling you what it's going to be and a little bit about it. And you can find key. If you work with WMI, knowing what the key to the class is very useful. And especially if you want to try and create one, or if you're working with the WSMAN commandlets. So you can find the key, and for processes to handle. Get CIM instance, very similar to get WMI object. You'll see a slightly different display because of the change in formatting. Ed mentioned that dates are translated for you, so there's no more of those weird and wonderful WMI dates that you have to go through the convert function. Yeah. We still get memory and bytes and all of that sort of stuff, we haven't quite got that there yet. But what does confuse a lot of people is when you look at the class and the object that's returned is this area. You lose the methods because what you get back is an inert object. So if you've done something like $O equals get WMI object Win32 operating system, and then you can call $O.shutdown or whatever, you can't do that anymore. You've got to use the invoke CIM method, which is not difficult. So we get class, or you get the particular instance of the object. We can use the create method. All we need is command line and current directory. You don't actually need that. Using the process startup information can get interesting because that's actually an embedded WMI object. It sort of works sometimes, if you're lucky. And you can create your object. You can get rid of it by using remove sim instance. How many of you worked with associations in WMI? Does everybody know what associations are in WMI? All right. WMI classes can be associated. So if you've got, the classic example is the net adapter class. That pulls back the information about the hardware. A network adapter configuration class is where you've got all of your IP information about that network adapter. And you've got to associate the two. And WMI associates them across the device or index number, and it's device on the adapter, it's index on the configuration. And it gets a little bit of a pain to work with it if you're trying to use the WMI commandlets because you have to write WQL query. It gets a lot easier with CIM commandlets. Just picking off a particular nick that I know is in there. And you can see all of the associated information. Now this whizzes past, and unfortunately, the one thing that it doesn't give you is the class that it's associated with. Now some of those you can probably guess if you've been around WMI, because that looks like the computer stuff. Some of that rest of the stuff, could be anything. So you can find the classes, and the one we want is the network adapter configuration. So what you can actually do is not that. You just tell it which class you want, and you see the results. That, to my mind, is a lot easier than writing a WQL query that says something like associators of blah, 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 and curly brackets and the quotes and everything else to get it working properly. So if you CIM commandlets make the working much, much easier, WMI. Okay, CIM sessions, which is the title of this. So we've got a few commandlets, get session, use CIM session, use CIM session options, remove CIM session. How many of you use PS remoting, PowerShell remoting? Look familiar? Yeah? Change CIM to PS. Right. It's not PowerShell remoting because all you can run is CIM over it, but the concept is the same. You're working over WSMAN by default. You're creating sessions in exactly the same way as you're doing with remoting. You can either use invoke command, run something against the remote machine once, or you create a session if you want to do things many times. It's the same with CIM sessions. Okay, so you run WMI against the local machine. Some information about your network adapters. Cool. You can run it remotely. Well, you can't actually because there isn't a computer name parameter. Look what there is, the CIM session. And the reason for this is that probably 2/3 of the commandlets are CDXML, which, if you haven't seen that, is one of the probably the coolest feature in PowerShell 3. You take a WMI class, wrap it into some XML, and publish it as a PowerShell module. And I think some of the faces in the audience I recognize that were in San Diego last year had me going on a great length about it. And it really, really, really is a brilliant piece of technology. So we can use CIM session, bingo, that works. And we can get a computer name, etc., etc. This is what I'm meaning about CDXML files. And if you look in the folders, a whole modules, you'll see an awful lot of them are like this. And if we just dig into the top of one of them, it's some lovely XML. These are not as difficult to write as it may seem. They are quite easy to put together, and they are very, very useful. And because it's WMI, you can actually access it directly. But these classes have not been installed on the older machines. Even if you put PowerShell 3 on Windows 2008-02 or Windows 7, you don't get the classes, so it won't work. That's going to fail. Any questions while we're waiting for this to fail? So,
one thing to mention on the sim session, I think most, if not all of them, you can pass the computer to the sim session parameter that will create a session.
if you all get that, you can pass the computer name into the sim session.
Well, yes and no, right? What if the computer you pass it is running PowerShell version 2? What's going to happen?
Well, that will fail at that point.
So, because you can pass the computer.
Well, no, I think what you meant is if you've got a session set up, you can identify the session by the computer name.
Okay.
Is that?
No, you can just, well, yeah, it has to be against a machine that you talk to WMID2, right? But if you target and say winning, or 4012, whenever it was, you can say get into that your dash sim session and give it a remote computer.
You've got a couple of other options with sessions. You can set some timeouts. You can skip testing for the connection. You can set particular ports. As with remoting, the options are there. Do you need to use them? Probably very, very rarely. The defaults work very well. You can tell particular certificates to use. On the options, you can use SSL, which I'll show you in a second. You can skip the certificate checks, the same as on remoting. And there's a bunch of stuff for working through a proxy, which I haven't got set up to demo that for you, unfortunately. Notice down at the bottom, the set of parameters there. Impersonation and packet privacy you get by default on DCOM sessions. Packet integrity is the next level down. I've never actually used it because everything that I've had a problem with, packet privacy has been required rather than packet integrity. It's there if you need it. And the other one is that you can play with the cultures that you're working with. So SSL is just another option. It does expect to have an SSL certificate at the far end. Okay. No. It does work, believe me. Please. All right. This is the bit that I really like. Sim sessions of WSMAN survive a reboot. So we create a session to that machine. We'll create another DCOM one. And show that they're live. We'll restart the machine. Right, so that's starting back up again. I said that sim session will survive a reboot, but only if you're running it over WSMAN. DCOM session won't survive. Any other questions while we're just waiting for this to come back?
So, sim sessions in DCOM, I have a lot of down-level clients.
Yeah.
And I desperately do not want to use I want to use the sim session instances. Is there a way that I can easily set a default sim session to use DCOM?
Yeah.
Without having to do all the typing of set option, new sim session?
Yeah. There's two ways to do it. If you've got my PowerShell and WMyBook, there's a function in there that basically looks at the remote machine, tests the WSMAN, and creates the appropriate session. Or if you don't like that approach, Jeff Hicks over in there did a blog post with a similar sort of thing. I think his function's a little simpler than mine. Either of those approaches will work a treat.
I just tweeted my link to the article.
Right. So that machine's back. So WSMAN 1 works, DCOM 1 fails with access denied. One final oddity, and this is a real oddity that Jeff discovered. Remember, we did that, and it failed. If you put a filter on it, it works. Now that, we spent a long weekend emailing backwards and forwards trying to explain this, and we still haven't successfully. We know it's not dropping back to DCOM.
Oh, it's not.
No, it's definitely not, because I turned off WinRM and tried it, and it protested. So it's not dropping back to DCOM. I think what it's doing is playing very, very cleverly with the WSMAN query that it sends. But I can't, because the only way I can look at that is in WSMAN trace, and that creates a whole bunch of stuff that I will need somebody to look at sometime. You're going to tell me how it works?
No, I don't. But you can ask Steve Lee. He has a session. I think it might be tomorrow. You should ask him this question.
Yep.
He might know. He's a test lead for WMI.
I have a nice working theory. The code path for the CIM and the auto-generated SIM stuff that goes down the filtering arc is different from the code path that just grabs an instance. So essentially, you might be just kind of lucking out because one of them could have the default programmed in, the other one.
Well, just before the session started, I was talking to Jeffrey Snover about this, and he was what? That shouldn't work. Please, it's not broken to feature. Can we keep it?
I don't know how Jeffrey discovered it. That's amazing.
Stand up and take a bow. And it doesn't really matter how you do the filter. That's just to prove that it's a Windows 2008 box. And that's the end of the demo. Any questions? And it's back on the half hour, so slightly early. So, what's questions, please?
So one other thing that I wanted to mention about the computer name Cranberry issue. So one thing that people get hung up or they don't realize sometimes when they're starting with when they're familiar with PowerShell and starting to use sim sessions is that sim sessions are actually inherently stateless. Whereas with PowerShell sessions, there's a server side that's running and you have state associated with that. So for example, you notice if you create a new PS session and you pass that session to invoke command and you store some state in that session, that state is stored on the server side. Say for example, you set a variable or whatnot. You across multiple invocations of invoke command with that same session, you can change the state of that variable, access it again, etc. Whereas with sim session, what it really is, it's essentially a collection of connection properties that allow you to reuse that same connection. It's not actually storing state on the server side like you have with PowerShell sessions. So that's an inherent difference between the two. And there's pros and cons to both mechanisms. For example, like you showed how you can reboot it and reconnect with the same session. And that's why that works, right? Because it's really, there isn't any state stored on the server. So you reboot it, you haven't lost anything. The connection properties are stored on the client. So you can just reconnect to that thing after reboot, which is really nice. You couldn't do that with the PowerShell session because on the server side, you have the thing stored in some state which is lost when you reboot. But it can be, so it's nice to understand those two differences and the underlying plumbing how it works. And understand certain behaviors.
Richard, have you noticed a difference in performance between using GetWMyObject and GetSim instance?
Don't think so. I have a feeling that CIM is a little bit faster, but I haven't actually had the environment to actually run a full set test on it. Actually, we're going to have an environment very soon, so I'll actually run that. I think it is slightly faster. I always put that down to the not running out of DCOM.
Yeah, it feels faster to me,
Yeah.
But I haven't gotten around to testing it actually, so I was hoping that maybe you had that you could either confirm it or not.
Well, Ed did a session somewhat about like this on the Dutch PowerShell user group, and based on that session, I tested some things, and sometimes it's even 3 times faster. Okay, you have to use a lot of objects and a lot of stuff in there, but it can be a lot faster.
Is that using a session or just using the computer name?
Session.
So if you use a session, well, that's going to be the same trade-off that you get with PowerShell remoting against invoke command, in that because you've got the session already there and you've got the links already there, and it knows where it's going and what it's doing. You haven't got that set up and tear down each time. So I would expect the session to be faster than a straight computer name call. Whether CIM is faster than the WMI, I haven't fully tested that, but it feels faster.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this during your session. I was kind of out, but one of the things that I find is really cool using GetSim instance is that it will work. When I said dash computer name, it works against my local computer. Did you talk about that? Yeah, I mentioned that if you don't use the computer name or a CIM session, it's using COM against the local machine. As soon as you put a computer name in or a session in, the computer name by default is going up WSMAN. The session by default will be WSMAN unless you particularly set the protocol when you set the session up. And then when you use credentials, it will allow you to use alternate credentials for that local connection to your local computer, whereas GetWMyObject always fails because it says you can't use alternate credentials for a local connection. So in the old days, what you had to do when you were using GetWMyObject is, so you've got this script and you're going to run it against 150 remote computers using DCOM, and you also want to get it off the local server too. So you have to do this if then or else kind of thing, to whether you're going to supply the credentials or not supply the credentials. Using GetSim instance now, all that if then or else stuff just goes away. You can just specify, hey, here's my CIM session, do all these computers, use these alternate credentials, groovy, go to it, and it works. And so it simplifies your coding scenario tremendously. And you just had a tremendous hint for how to do your scripts, the scripting games. There are marks for style and elegance in these games.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Richard Siddaway.
Thank you.